Hi guys, welcome back. We'll get started with an interesting panel discussion today. And let me first introduce the four wonderful panelists we have here. The first is Hemangi, who just got introduced, right? So, but maybe I'll still give a brief introduction. So she's a professor in the Department of CS at IIT Guwahati. And she got her PhD from the London South Bank University, and her research is broadly in the area of computer architecture, specifically in multi-core caches and emerging NVM technologies. And for more credibility to her work is that she won this year's Outstanding Contributions in Computing by a Women Award, right, which is super prestigious. So congratulations, Hemangi, and welcome to the panel. And up next, we have Preeti, who's an assistant professor at IIIT Bangalore. She specializes in human-computer interaction, science and technology studies, and communication studies. Her research focuses on the intersection of technology and social justice using ethnographic and field immersion methods. And her design has contributed to features that were globally rolled out in Samsung phones. And Preeti was named the inaugural Women in Tech Fellow awarded by the Australian Consulate Bangalore. So welcome to the panel, Preeti. And up next, we have Priyanka, who is an assistant professor in the CS department at IIT Delhi. Prior to that, she was a faculty at the CISPA Helmholtz Center for Information Security, Germany. She completed her PhD through a joint degree program between IIT Kanpur and NUS Singapore. Her research interests lie at the intersection of formal methods and artificial intelligence. And her work specifically has focused on designing scalable automated synthesis and testing techniques. And she's received multiple Best Paper nominations. So welcome to the panel, Priyanka. And at the end, we have Niyati, who is currently a co-founder at Hyperbots. She spent a decade at Adobe Research before starting up Hyperbots as a part of their research team focused on NLP and multimodal content understanding. She holds a PhD from the University of Maryland, which was at the intersection of vision and language. And in addition to her industry career, she has been teaching at IIIT Hyderabad and ISB as an adjunct faculty. So welcome, Niyati. Okay, so a lot of technical stuff and non-technical we'll discuss over the course of the next 1.5 hours. But before that, I wanted to get everyone warmed up. And this is something they were not aware of, which is I'm going to do a very, very rapid fire. 3 questions, no thinking, just answer what you can think of, right? We'll start from you, Niyati. If not computing, what would have been your alternate career?
Music.
Wonderful. Priyanka?
Teaching. Teacher.
Okay.
Filmmaker.
Wow, okay.
Not computing.
Computing, what would have been your alternate career?
Physics.
Okay, that's still close. Okay, what do you do outside of work as an hobby? Maybe you can start.
Oh, I like to do embroidery, knitting, stitching.
Wow,
but I've never
wonderful.
done that in past 20 years. But that I like.
Okay, Preeti?
A lot of films. So I recently also began an account just to document the various avatars of Bollywood in Bangalore traffic. So I go around observing what autos put behind on as part of their posters. My Instagram account is called Silver Screen to Auto Screens. So if you're interested in finding me looking at Bollywood traveling through Bangalore traffic, please follow me. It's a very new account. I'm looking for followers.
I like to draw cartoons actually in my free time.
Wow.
So that's it. Yeah.
I play the violin, so I try to
Wow.
play whenever I'm.
What's one thing on your work desk you can't be without, or something that's unusual on your work desk?
So there is a small bird-like cartoon or whatever, a small toy, which has been on every desk I have been since my master's, which was like a few years ago, or more than a decade ago. And it's a second-hand toy that I inherited from a senior in my PhD lab. Somehow it has been with me always,
Wonderful.
including where I work now.
There is a basic pen which my grandfather actually gave to me when I was about to write my 12th exam. And since then, that pen is with me. And that's something that I can't, like, it always has to be there at the right place. So that's
Awesome.
Well, mine is seasonal currently because it was winter. It was hand cream because my hands get dry, so I have nothing really profound to say.
Something unusual or something you can't live without on your work desk.
I need rough sheets. I mean, I generally prefer single-sided print papers to save paper, and I have extra pen because I have to give them to students who don't bring notebooks.
If I ask this question to any of the researchers now, right, I would assume the answer would be a mobile phone. But I'm so glad none of you mentioned that. Yeah. Okay. So maybe we'll get started with some technical questions, right? So each of you here, I'm super excited about this panel because we have a representative from almost every area of computer science, if you think about it, right? So the first question is, can you share with us your personal journey of how you got into this particular area of computer science and how did that work? We'll start with Niyati.
Yeah, I'll talk about it. So right now I work in the space of AI for finance, predominantly looking at unstructured and structured data and then putting a lot of math around it, especially accounting and finance math. How did I get here? At Adobe, I was working with a lot of documents, and I knew where PDFs won't work, or I know where technology will start failing for unstructured documents or unstructured information. And I wanted to solve something that LLMs can't solve. So that is the last kind of decision I took when I moved from Adobe to a startup. I was trying to look for a problem which I wanted to envision that just prompting LLMs won't be solvable in the near future. And that's how I ended up working on the current space. Originally, the area I actually worked on in the PhD was intersection of using language to improve computer vision models. And that also is something I stumbled upon. So I interned at NIH, where essentially I was working with images of disaster victims. And this was maybe 2010 kind of timeline. So for the US, 9/11 was fresh and they still needed technology to solve mass disasters. And at that time, computer vision models were not able to deal with any kind of occlusions. In this case, a lot of debris and stuff like that. So I ended up stumbling upon essentially the problem I was dealing with was, can I use human language and train these models? The medium was graphical models at that point in time. So that's essentially, I just stumbled upon the problem during an internship, and then my advisor pursued towards kind of forcing me to solve it, but I enjoyed it. Yeah.
Do you want to go, Priyanka?
So I work at the intersection of formal methods and AI, and many students here. So I know that you don't know what do we mean by formal methods, and trust me, I also did not know when I joined as a PhD candidate. So one fine day, I was in the lift, and where my then my PhD advisor Shubhajit with his current student Avnish, they were just chit chatting and laughing their heart out about some paper they just read. And I did not know both of them. Like, for me, they were stranger. I just knew Shubhajit, like, as a faculty member. I did not have any idea about Amnish. And they were laughing, and the kind of conversation they were having, I felt like they have a very nice, healthy relationship. So I was like, yeah, this person looks like a nice faculty to work with, and I can have my PhD with him. So then I went and I checked his profile, and I got to introduce this world of formal methods. Of course, I knew about discrete math, logic and all, but I did not know at that time they all fall into this broader umbrella of formal methods. So then I went and I had a chat with Shubhajit, and Shubhajit gave me a couple of papers to read. And trust me, it was not a love at the first sight. I hated it. I was not able to, there was mathematically rigorous things, and I was not able to make sense. It was very difficult for me to write anything and everything. But slowly and slowly, I just fall into the love with this topic. And still now, I'm just working in the same direction, formal methods and AI. That's how.
That's wonderful. And you made a very important point, right? Which is sometimes we get drawn to fields not because of the area, but also because of the people. And I also got drawn into systems and storage systems because of the advisor I met. Yeah, great. Preeti?
Yes, so my story is really about being the wrong person in the wrong place at the wrong time. during my PhD program, where there was a lack of alignment with what I seemed to be drawn to and what my department was, the path that my department was taking. What it did was that it forced me to look outside my immediate vicinity. And I very serendipitously stumbled upon the technology for emerging markets at Microsoft Research. And I was very startled to see that something that is in the domain of computer science is also turning its attention towards interrogating, building, studying technology use in practice for underserved populations. And this was also during the mid 2000s to the late 2000s, where researchers at MSR in the technology for emerging markets were very influentially shaping a particular narrative of technology for development. And they also they came together collectively to found a particular scholarly domain called ICTD, or Information and Communication Technologies for Development. So that is how it all began. And from there, then, several of us who were interning at the lab, we later moved on to publishing in HCI venues such as ACM Chi. And very grateful to the time that I spent at the lab, but also with time, I have a sense of critical distance from what that narrative, what that discourse was. And I am also increasingly very critical of how, when engineers get into designing technology for populations, when engineers speak the language of development, very welcome, very encouraging, very nice to see them appreciate qualitative methods like understanding what field work is, understanding what field observations add to it. But also, how does it translate into the metrics of success? So you're still holding dear very engineering-centric methods of what counts for success, which would be scale, expansion, innovation. And I increasingly feel that, especially when you're talking about social justice, when you're talking about development, the metric that you should follow is really pursuing irrelevance of what you're doing. So I just wanted to put that disclaimer out there because that's been very integral to my path.
Oh, well, I never thought I will become a faculty. I was happy to get a job as a software engineer. And I worked for 2 years in an industry. But a person like me, I like to study. And there was less to study in a software industry. And with doing a BTech and an MTech from IIT, we were trained to study and keep doing something nicer, innovative. And first 2 years in the industry didn't give me that opportunity. And I was like, I don't want to do this next 30 years of my life working for others. So can I work for myself and either become an entrepreneur or an academician? So I chose the second path, and that's how I became a IIT faculty.
Wonderful. So each area of computer science or computing that you guys work in is not going to be without challenges, right? So there's compute requirement challenges, or you work at the intersection of two fields, so there could be challenges, field work, etc. So what is the major challenge in the area that you work in, be it technical or non-technical? And how do you overcome it? You want to go first?
Right. So my current area, as you saw in my talk, is on emerging memories. My PhD was in formal methods, which she mentioned. Again, I have no idea of what formal methods was, but my master's thesis at IIT Bombay, because that term I didn't understand, and I'm an inquisitive person. What I don't understand, I want to learn. And that is the reason back in 1998, I did my master's in formal methods. PhD again in formal methods. But when I joined as a faculty, that entrepreneurship was there, and I didn't get students in formal methods because students didn't have confidence in the topic. It was seen to be very difficult. I pursued that for patience, perseverance for 4 years, but 7 years after your PhD, if you do not get a PhD student, your career looks bleak. So what do we do? And hence I thought I should change my research area. And since my BTech days, I was fascinated with digital circuits. So I thought, let me try architecture. I had no training in advanced architecture. So I learned the topic. I taught it for 2 years. And then I took my first PhD student in computer architecture. So that was my first hurdle, to change area, learn a new topic, and start working in that. Once we start working, you need to know the business rules. What are the simulation tools? If you have done PhD in that, you know what is the setup, lab setup. Here, I had to start from scratch. So there used to be a simulator which was free. 2-3 years it was free. After that, it became commercial with 22 lakhs academic license price. And where will the money come from? So with great difficulty, I got a sponsored project. We purchased that tool because my PhD student was halfway through and we could not just forego the tool and change the PhD topic. So that was my first challenge, to obtain the money to purchase the tool. Eventually, a free version, an open source tool has come up. But the next hurdle there was how to convince the student to move from the paid version to the free version. These tools are not easy. You have to keep motivating the students to learn because they are full system simulators, even accepted by Intel and other industries. It is difficult to work to convince the students, and buying servers to run them. Again, money is required for us. And workforce, convincing students to work in systems is the biggest challenge. Yeah, so that is ever going thing. It's not solved ever.
Yeah, one of the most important takeaways for me from today's talk for yours and even what you mentioned now is we all have to perpetually learn, right? Learning never stops, and the moment you stop that, I think you'll stop growing
We stop
in some
growing.
sense. Yeah, that's very nice. Preeti?
Yeah, so for me, the challenge is really speaking to people who hold positions of power and authority, mainly because of the kind of work that I do. Most of my work in the recent past has been on biometric infrastructures and how Aadhaar mediates food security in India. For those of you who don't know, if you need to get your monthly rations, which most of the poor in India do from the government, you have to pass fingerprint verification. Other than that, you don't get your food entitlements. And I have been very invested in understanding errors, failures, breakdowns in the way that the entire process unfolds, mainly because A, it is a monthly thing, there is no getting away from it. And also the sheer emotional investment that India has in Aadhaar as an infrastructure. And when I speak to people in the government, there is a certain sense of, an investment in protecting technology and serving technology rather than have technology serve us. And at first, I used to think that maybe the kind of evidence that I'm presenting is not something that they want to easily accept because I'm an ethnographer. It means that I spend long hours in the field longitudinally over many years, interviewing people, gathering observations. That becomes my data. Long form ethnographic writing is how my work gets published. And in the beginning, I would be dismissed saying that this is anecdotal evidence. You do not have numbers. And just coming from two different schools of methodology, because obviously these are government officials also coming from a technical and an engineering background. In the course of my fieldwork, I ended up filing a right to information application to understand how many children participate in the monthly process of Aadhaar authentication, because my fieldwork showed that instead of adults coming to verify their fingerprints, they would often send children for various reasons. And because children's fingerprints are more easily passed, their time is something that can be easily spared because several of the beneficiaries are daily wage workers. If they have to come to the ration shop, it means they have to forego their wage because it just takes a lot of time because of several infrastructural failures. And I found that children were missing school to do this. And therefore, I sought details under RTI and I got a lot of quantitative data. Not that that too was accepted very easily. So my challenges are a bit different given that I'm a social scientist studying technology, often speaking to people and asking them questions who hold positions of power. So I just come from a slightly different perspective on this.
Yeah, it's very interesting because we always think computing or researchers in computer science are those who sit in front of a computer or a piece of paper. That's a still broader description, right? But we don't really understand the challenges that people face, especially on the field. That's yeah, absolutely.
So again, formal methods, right? So it is surprisingly sad and funny at the same time, that the challenge that Himangi mentioned that she faced about a decade or 2 decades ago about not getting students in formal methods still is the same scenario. I guess the main reason, and please correct me in the audience if I am not making sense, is that we don't introduce the world formal methods to our undergrad students. Uh, and we as an academia altogether need to work on that in order to solve that challenge. That is not just limited to me as specifically, all the PL and the formal method group working out there, which is the key for the verification that we need to do. The more and more emerging complex systems are part of our day-to-day life, the more we need trust on them. And that's where the formal methods and PL community comes into. So we need to introduce this particular term specifically to our undergrad student. That's one thing. So getting student is a big challenge. But as a side part, the term automated reasoning is now emerging, right? So because it has a inbuilt component of like AI, ML, the students are now like want to learn what do we mean by automated reasoning. And a formal method researcher, we just plug in our research under that particular broader umbrella of automated reasoning. That's how we solve that particular challenge. Another big challenge, I think, particularly in our community specifically, is the scalability of the tools that we develop. Because again, we want to handle the complex systems, and more and more the systems are getting complex. It is difficult for the existing tools to verify them. Scalability is a big concern for us, and we are slowly working towards it, but we are far behind. And I really don't know how we are going to overcome that. It's a active area of research, and we all are contributing to it.
I'll give a different perspective. So she talked about, Preeti mentioned that people ask for numbers and qualitative stuff, or maybe anecdotes are not enough, or qualitative information is not enough. When you want to productize AI and machine learning, numbers don't work. They want to see a correct output. That's it. In the product, on a customer's data, the whole thing has to work. End of story. No one cares what it takes to build that. So the biggest challenge as someone who is building AI, fairly native AI for a customer, and especially in this case, enterprise or business customers, is ensuring accuracy. And accuracy in terms of the productivity gain that customer will gain. I cannot go and say I'm at 100% recall or 99% precision on my test set. On any random sample thrown to the system, it has to look like it is correct. So lot of scaffolding, lot of logic, cleanup, what not to show to the customer. And those kind of bootstrapping is needed to take AI to production. That's one. Second is, now someone in the MLAI space, I finished my PhD in 2012, end of 2012. 2013 is Word2Vec. So deep learning started right when I finished, right? So the availability of deep learning started around that time. Doing deep learning in a space where every morning there is a new model, and ensuring that as a stakeholder you are taking the right choice and deploying and experimenting with the last model is hard. So I've come to a point that yes, I'll keep up to pace to the extent that I can, but at the end of the day, I'll have a set of metrics that will say, these are the problems I want to solve, either for me as a researcher, my team as a researcher, or the customer. Beyond that, it's okay if I miss Llama 3 point whatever and I was using Llama 3.x, right? So keeping up with pace, ensuring you are updated, and taking those decisions on the fly is hard. And obviously you have infrastructure related challenge. So I'm comparing Adobe, which was a fairly well-established product company who has a research team away from a product kind of a thing, to a startup where you're building a product based on AI. Compute, which is affordable and available. Data, which is affordable and available. Both of them are a challenge, and you have to do jugaad, for a lack of better word, and making sure that it's working. But it's fun. But these are the kind of challenges on the practical side.
So you just led into the next topic I was thinking about, which is generative AI is kind of transforming our lives both personally and well as professionally, right? So how has it impacted your fields of computing? I think you alluded to most of it, but
I work on generative AI. So if like from an NLP perspective, instead of using parse trees to understand grammar, we are using LLMs to understand grammar. I don't even know why, but basically language models can generate language, and that's the first time ever that language transformers can generate language, and that's what is changing. So what has happened, unfortunately, is because these things are available easily, both closed source and open source, explainability has become harder. And second is things that can be solved by small predictive models or SVMs are being now solved by big few million parameter models. There is no need of doing that. So that challenge of when not to pick generative AI is something as researchers we should be grounded on. Is what I feel.
So my PhD was in the area of synthesis. Synthesis is basically taking a specification and giving you a function code circuit that satisfies that specification that you gave. And that is exactly what generative AI systems are doing, right? So when we ask our student and first year student to write a program, they ask ChatGPT that they want a program that calculate the max of two functions. That is the specification, and the generative AI will give you the function. Then now what? My whatever the thing that I did in my PhD is not relevant. I don't know. So yeah, this is like literally a big challenge. But at the same time, I think coming from the verification context, whatever is this LLMs are producing, how do we trust that? And that is an emerging direction in which the formal method people are, that's like an opportunity for us to tell the world that this area is important and you can't trust the LLM generated codes and systems or whatever it is, and you need a verification process out of that. So that is the another area in which I'm working. I just want to share a small story. So
Sure, go ahead.
so I got so my first PhD student, right? So we started doing a project in which I asked him to do a synthesis related work. So I gave him a couple of small toy examples, specification, and say that come up with your own approach. How will you synthesize functions? And then he went home and he asked ChatGPT, and ChatGPT was able to give the right answer for all those 4 toy examples. And he was like, "Ma'am, why do I need to come up with something? Because ChatGPT gave me the answer." And I was like, "Okay, good. I don't know how to refute that." So yeah, that's a kind of.
But
challenge.
I think the learning that PhD gives us is how to be agile and how to find opportunities in new things, right? And I think we are all trying really hard to do that. And yeah, like how you insert reasoning. Yeah, Preeti.
So currently, as far as generative AI is concerned, I think my challenges are mainly in the classroom and speaking to students about it, and not coming at it in a way that tells them not to use it, but rather how to use it more effectively. I'm also beginning a project on understanding how text-to-image platforms are influencing, shaping, maybe marginalizing visual art practitioners in India. And I hope to share more about it as my work progresses. But if I remove generative AI and only talk about AI, especially returning back to my domain of governance and social justice and public technologies, I think something that a lot of us are grappling about is that when AI mediates government-citizen interactions, and suppose it falters, as technology is often wont to do, who takes responsibility for it, right? And that is not something that we are very easily able to identify. Can you hold an algorithm responsible in the same way that you can hold a human responsible? Because then various things can unfold. They can be given a show cause notice, they can be fired, lots of things can happen. You know, you can attribute a mistake and you can understand how best to correct it. But can algorithms be held responsible in the same manner? So a very philosophical question. I don't really see that we are very close to having an answer, but that is something that we are currently trying to think our ways through.
So similar to Priyanka, we face as teachers problem that when you give any assignment to students, they are going to ask ChatGPT and bring the answers. So that's one challenge. At times it helps because if we are stuck in certain modules, and even it does HDL coding, Verilog coding also ChatGPT is able to do. And few years ago, one of my master's students, I gave some work, and within 2 days, the answer was ready, which I knew he wouldn't be able to do. And then I asked, "How did you get this?" He said, "Okay, ma'am, I took help from Gen AI tools." But to look at it from the positive aspect, it helps where we are stuck. So definitely credit to the technology. And the other, from the threat angle, I tell my students not to use generative AI to do basic emailing and documentation tasks, because now is summer is approaching. Every day 10 internship emails come. All of them look same, and I know how ChatGPT talks, right? So in fact, our internal students also keep writing they want a BTech project. I get an email of one kind. And if I refuse, another email which looks different, but that is not the student's English. And I will say that if you wanted BTech projects so desperately, why didn't you write a 2-line, your own authentic email instead of writing 4 paragraphs generated? And with my already registered students, I tell them, if you are writing me a simple email of 4 lines, write it in your own crooked, whatever grammatically wrong English, but you write it yourself, because anyway, ChatGPT will be able to do it when you want it, at your exam time or wherever you want. I mean, job interview or applications, in the need of hours you use it, but as a learning experience you have to write your own language. I will help you to correct it, or you give it to these tools to correct the grammar, but you write your own content. That is what I tell my students every time.
Completely agree with that, right? And I think one of the biggest learnings of PhD for me personally also has been the experience of writing your first paper. You write it, you give it to your advisor, and it comes back with full red ink. It's wrong. Change this. Doesn't read well, right? And we do multiple iterations of it, and that's how we learn how to convey a complex idea in a nice way. And now people just resort to these tools, and I think you have to use it with caution for your own good in general, right? Yeah.
And I would, I tell the students, if you have used, you tell me which paragraphs are generated, because a reader who's expert in the field can make out the gap in the linking of the topic. Because the way I write a story, and if suddenly ChatGPT inserts a paragraph, it won't make sense, because ChatGPT doesn't know what you want to say. It is just going to generate something. So for us to learn and to evolve as humans, we have to keep our capacity of creative writing alive. Use ChatGPT as a helper, not as your assistant. I mean, it should not govern you. You should be in your own control.
Yeah, absolutely. So I thought after these technical discussions, we can maybe go a little bit deeper into each one of your career journeys so far. And so maybe Niyati, we can start with you. So you worked at a research lab for maybe less than a decade, but close to a decade, and then you transitioned to now starting up your own company, right? And what prompted you to do that, and how difficult? In general, we know startup is a difficult thing, but being a woman, has it been any additionally difficult? And how has this journey been?
Yeah.
You can take your time.
A lot of questions. But what prompted me to do this? So I actually spent a full decade at Adobe, and took a sabbatical, which you can take after 10 years. And that break helped in thinking if what I am doing is what I want to do. That is one. This was right after the time when ChatGPT got released, and I have spent hours, days, months trying to make GPT 1, 2, 3, whatever work. So versions before these transformers started working, I have spent time trying to make them work for useful things. So this kind of gave an opportunity where I started feeling that there is a need to create something where impact is fast. And Adobe is a great place to work at. Some point in time, I may even go back there. But because of the organization structure and strategies that have longer plans, taking anything to productization is a long journey, like few years usually. Once in a while, few months. So when I say few months, it's maybe say 10 months. Easiest, fastest. So I was looking for pace. I was also looking for kind of, I want a problem which is at the intersection of not just language, something that has an impact. Originally, I did think that maybe I should look for social impact kind of things, but did not land up doing that. And something that was hard for language models to do. So just because I understood these architectures, I knew what they can't do, and that's the gap I was looking for. With that thought in mind, all I did was I went to LinkedIn, started looking for head of AI, early stage startup, or co-founder or CTO, technology co-founder, and randomly started applying to people. And that's how I started talking to like folks. I was talking to multiple people at the same time, and incidentally, I was introduced to my current co-founder in a network, through academic network. And he is a second time entrepreneur. So for him, he wanted to solve a horizontal business process. For me, I wanted to solve it against certain kinds of semi-structured or unstructured data. And we started talking, and it worked out. Has it been hard? Has it been different? Yes. But is it still exciting and very new? So I've been doing this for around 18 months now, or yeah, pretty much 16 to 18 months now. And very new, very exciting. You can quickly see what you are thinking out there. What is very, very challenging is finding people who will bet onto that startup with the same grit that you have bet onto it. So you want to build a team. Your founding team has to be your people, I mean your friends, or who will tell you that no, you are wrong, or no, you are right, all of that, and people who listen to you, right? So building that team has been hard. As we mature, finding bouncing boards has been very hard. So that's where I pretty much tap into my existing friends or network outside or academia and things like that to understand that am I taking the right decision. So being at a place where you don't quite have someone who will question you in your space is very hard. It feels like, okay, am I doing something right each day? And then you are answerable, right? You are answerable to your investors, you are answerable to your customers. That appreciation so I think that came to me after I moved to doing a startup. So in Adobe, the stakeholder was best case the CEO or the product owner. Here your stakeholder is the customer who's going to make sure your company is running. So understanding that what they want is not necessarily the best accuracy or the best patent or a paper. So that appreciation of what a customer wants from a product perspective came later. As a woman, is there certain challenges? I think so far I am not able to differentiate between a challenge that may have been in a normal industry lab versus a startup. The same trying to manage time and deciding when to stop, especially if you like the work that you do, it's like a constant conflict. And I still look up to people who have been doing it longer than I have been doing it. How do you ever decide when to stop? Like, because work is so good. There's so much other stuff apart from work that you expect out of yourself and everyone in the world expects out of you. How do you stop? So I think that is a constant challenge. Other maybe a little bit of a startup challenge that I'm facing as a female is that in startup there are very short decision timelines, especially like, let's say, can you travel next week to the US? Usually in a big company, no one will say, they'll say, okay, 3 months ke baad you go. And then you have time to work around ecosystem. Here, when someone says that, you know there's a customer waiting, you know the customer wants that AI person to go and talk. So that conflict and the confidence or strength to go and say, no, I won't do it is something I still struggle with. So it's a every few week thing. Can you go next week? No, I will not go. Or I'll go, all of that. So that's something I'm learning, but I think that is a little bit of a unorganized or hustle setup of a startup that brings in, and a little bit of a female or a woman challenge that comes. But otherwise, I think similar challenges everywhere.
That's so candid. Thank you for sharing that. I think we don't always get to hear the entrepreneurial side of things and the challenges that come with it. So this was really insightful. So Priyanka, you have been the most recent graduate here in the lot, right? And the folks here might relate to your advices the most. So as a recent graduate, that too from India, a PhD graduate from India, we all know it does have its challenges, but there are also opportunities, right? So both as a woman and in general as a PhD candidate in India, what were your challenges and opportunities as well that you think people should utilize?
So let me first talk about the challenges, and I will see how that turned out to be an opportunity rather than a challenge. So in India, for any PhD student, I see where we lack, and that is the situation where how to communicate. We don't have an opportunity to attend our events, which is usually for the CS, it's a conference, and mostly, which is not an ideal case, but mostly abroad, US and Europe, which is very costly. So we need paper to attend that conference, and even with the paper, we need lots of funding to attend that conference. So we don't get that kind of exposure at the beginning of a career as a first year or second year PhD student to see what the other people are doing, what kind of struggle is there, what do we mean by a conference, like until unless, like if we don't see what we mean by a conference, how can we expect a student to submit a paper to conference? I don't know. So these were the challenges that are there for the PhD students specifically in India. I was fortunate enough to have a joint degree program with NUS, and my advisor there at NUS, Kuldeep, had a lot of funding. So I attended a lot of workshops and conferences at the beginning of my PhD career, and that really, really helped me. So that one thing is really missing in Indian academia and Indian PhD student point of view. And because we do have some industry people out here, I would like to call upon fundings for first year, second year PhD student without a paper to attend a conference. Just, just out there, right? Yeah, so that's one challenge. The other thing I would again say is the communication in terms of, so we usually a PhD student in India don't know, and again I'm saying usually, the exceptions are always there, is that how to communicate effectively their research to the audience who are not familiar from their, they are not from their area. And what I noticed is, and what I experienced in NUS specifically, I don't know about the other universities, that they have courses to make sure that you're good at communication. They like take you through the writing profile, writing workshops, and so on and so forth. That is again missing in the Indian academia curriculum. These are the two things I would say it's made a lot of impact on me with this joint degree program. At the same time, nowadays, Indian academia is exploring these kind of joint degree program, from which I benefited with lots of other universities, NUS, Australia, Europe, US, and so on and so forth. So I encourage students out here to look for these kind of opportunity that will give you a lot of exposure outside, and that is much needed in nowadays. So,
Yeah, sure. So, Preeti, from talking to you, it's very evident that you are so excited about also bringing systemic changes in addition to your research, right, in terms of society. But how do you balance these two roles as a researcher and as someone who's advocating for a systemic change?
I don't know whether. So there is a conflict that I. Yeah, so there is often this tension, friction between, what your responsibility and what you're able to do as a researcher, and then what are you able to do as an activist, as somebody who's actively intervening to bring about change. I am not sure that I fall on the activism end of the spectrum. I still tend to look at myself very much as a researcher whose agenda is to write and put things out in the public domain. For me, impact would generally look like having the ability to shape and influence public opinion and bend it towards the arc of social justice, towards speaking in favor of the marginalized. And it takes time to be able to get to a position where you're doing that. So I think my trajectory is very much a work in progress, because I also fundamentally feel that a lot of these things are forged in the classroom. Am I able to speak about this to students, convince them, persuade them? If I'm succeeding there, then that itself is a kind of impact, and maybe that will scale over time to coming out into the public domain, speaking to the public, putting these things out into the public sphere. So I think I currently don't really have too much of a balancing act to do, because I don't look at myself as an activist, because especially in the domain that I work for, food activists are very prominent, doing excellent jobs. There are also reporters. Journalism also has a very important role to play. So I tend to think of all of us at a spectrum. I am able to speak to the research, to the academic community. Journalists are able to translate some of my findings into public-facing articles, because academia language tends to be very dense. You know, everybody sitting in the ivory towers. Activists are on the ground, on the field, advocating for change, lobbying with authorities and powers. So I also look at us as a collective, because each one of us has a role to play. And I'm happy being a part of that ecosystem and doing my bit there. So I am part of things that balance out, rather than me only trying to balance things out.
Absolutely love that last statement that you made, right? Yeah, being a part of the ecosystem and driving the change. It's also very fulfilling for you to be a small part of that big change that's coming up. So Hemangi, you have been advising and mentoring students for over 2 decades now, right? And you also alluded to this earlier in the day. How do you set up your lab and lab culture in such a way that both men and women can thrive? Because being a woman PhD and maybe slightly later into your career can be very challenging. So how do you make your lab a conducive environment for those kind of candidates? And how has that style changed for you over the years?
So mentoring students over 20 years, I will give a generic answer than gender specific. So I had less opportunity to mentor students in the early career, because for 7 years I did not get a PhD student due to the formal method subject. But once I got students in systems and architecture, even the first few years I was learning with the student. So it was less student mentor, but a teamwork kind of opportunity. So it worked well. But a general comment is the initial generation of students were very dedicated, hardworking. They used to spend more hours in the lab. And the new generation has a delta difference. They want weekend offs, which was not the trend earlier. And getting frustrated as a supervisor with this demand is of no use, because they are not going to change. We have to change. So accordingly, I have adapted myself so that we get enough work done during the weekdays. But then, have I changed? Do I take weekends off? No. But I think I should learn from them and take weekends off now that 20 years in the career. I also need a weekend off. So maybe that is something to learn from the new generation. We were not trained like that, so we are not that way. So the working hours and the working type has changed over the generations, but the students are students. So you have to treat them initial first 2 years, you have to do hand-holding with I'm talking of PhD students because that's easier to answer. They stay with us for 5 to 6 years. So first 2 years, you have to do hand-holding. You have to understand what is their skill set, what are their strengths, what are their weaknesses, and accordingly tune the problem to that level. So you might have to tone it down, you might have to tone it up if the student is capable. So that is all you have to keep doing, which is not visible in any output. Nobody will be able to find out why I gave this problem to the student. Because they will complain that I was not given this statement research problem, but you were given. So I will say it will take 2 hours to explain, and you have to have faith in the advisor. What is given, you do that, because I know what you're capable of. So that was a generic. I will treat students as students no matter what the generation is. The new generation is, again, they are more friendlier, or they treat us at the same level compared to the older students who used to treat us as teacher, student. Here it's more friendly. And if you are not friendly, then a gap gets generated. So I try to be friendly with the students so that we still have a good relationship and output comes. Regarding gender, I always had diversity in my lab. Initial years, there were only men students because the women population in IIT was very less. Master students, we used to have some women, but PhD level very less. Again, to work in systems, women have some reservations because they think it is very hard, so much coding, so much this, so much that, and Some used to join for some small project and feel that it is difficult. However, slowly I started getting one or two, and then I used to set them as role models or examples to the junior students. See, she can do it, so you can also do. Slowly, I got women students, and now my women students are mentors to their juniors. So that becomes a really big thing for the men students, because they see senior women helping them. So they don't carry the superiority complex that I can only work in systems. And the other aspect is their mentor herself is a woman. So if my man student has come to me, so he believes that there is no difference between a man and a woman. We are both equally capable and technologically. So everything is, if and at a humanity level, if we respect each other, then there is no man-woman divide.
Absolutely. I think you touched upon several important points in mentoring, like respect, trust, and setting mentors and role models. I think those are extremely important for anyone who's starting their new career. And Priyanka, I think you're doing great because you already have a PhD student and in the same area, right? So that brings me to
Maybe
the
one
yeah,
comment.
sure,
You
go
were
ahead.
talking about weekends, right? Weekends is still okay. I am not able to solve this work hour issue. So large proportion of newer generation people work in non-daytime hours, irrespective of
Absolutely,
wherever
yes.
they are. So for folks who have other things to worry about, which is say older generation or maybe have family and all of that, they prefer to work in daytime hours. So that is something I haven't been able to crack. Like unless you behave like a principal and take attendance, I don't think there is any other way
Yeah, I
out
think
here.
that's very true, right? Like most of the younger generation, how many of you go to bed before 12 a.m.? I think very few, right? They wake up in the noon and they work until 12 a.m. And I think we have had to adapt to that, right? And because as you exactly mentioned, right, especially as women, we have this kind of a second shift phenomenon, which is we work a shift in office and then we come back home. There's other set of responsibilities that we have to deal with, which we cannot forego, right? How are you able to draw a boundary in situations like these, and how are you able to manage your work life balance and give time to your family, kids, and
So there are certain hours in the day which I become offline. It may be for me. Usually, it's certain hours in the evening or after a point in time I go to sleep or whatever. Um, Even if I have calls later in the night, I'll say there are certain hours I will not take calls. Or similarly, at least say in my case, my team knows she'll be there from 8:30 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. and that is the time she'll be there. And then if you ask for her from let's say 5 p.m. to 7 p.m., she won't be there. Those kind of things, just by practice, is how I have tried to implement. Doesn't work 100% of the time, but at least mentally I feel, yeah, there is a time it's okay. I'm not, people can call, do whatever, but I will not be available. So that small time is helping me. But I think you may have more experience. Like how have you been able to establish that?
Work-life balance. I don't know about industry because I just spent 2 years there, and then I hardly had any family responsibilities. A fresh graduate, but then I wasn't enjoying the work because I don't like to be instructed what to do. That's my nature. Um, so in academia, I got freedom, but if you exploit that freedom, you won't grow. So even if I was in academia, which did not put working hours on me, if I don't put that discipline on myself, I would make a mediocre career. So I was always ambitious to do something. And so I call it like running a business, run your own lab. So unless you work, you interact with students, you won't get your customers who are your students. Right. Um, well, but the work-life balance shifts with your stages in your life. So initially, when you have a small child, you would have to spend more time there and less time at work. But you have to keep a goal in front of you that I have this X plus Y division of my time because I have a young child or infant to look after. But that Y has to reduce and the X has to increase as the child grows. And if you forget that, you might still have the old X plus Y division, and which will not take you further. And again, your professional hours, you have to keep targets of your growth, like a businessman keeps a target. So I have one student, next year I should have two. I have these many publications next. So your throughput should keep on increasing. And if you have that goal, then you don't need to do anything. you will schedule it yourself because you want that to be done. Scheduling your time and keeping goals and prioritizing, that is what keeps you going. And in all this, weekends just fly off.
Do you have any thoughts to add as relatively younger faculty?
So I'm not at this stage where I have responsibility family wise. I don't have kid at this moment. But what I notice myself is that whenever there is a family event, specifically at my in-laws side, and supposedly if they coincide with my paper deadline or something which is very important to me professionally, I feel super guilty. And I feel that I'm explaining to themselves that, because of so and so reason, I will not be able to come. I will try to do it like a bit extra next time so that they don't feel that I'm like not giving them time and all. I don't know. Maybe because statistically also women have more emotional quotient. Maybe I don't know. But that is one thing which I feel is different from male to female point of view, where you feel guilty of putting your professional life up slightly above than your personal and life. That's something that is I'm still trying to figure out how to have that balance in between. I'm not able to figure that out yet.
Yeah, that's an absolutely relevant problem. Yes.
So I don't really have any lived experience to share about family responsibilities interfering. And it makes me think that every time women talk about personal life, why is it that the family is so centered in it rather than their own interests and their own hobbies? Having a personal life just tends to be equated with kids, with husband, with in-laws. I also feel that when we talk about work-life balance, it's a very neat binary that serves male interests. Whereas for women, when we talk about work-life balance, it's work balance, yes, but even within life, there is always life-life balance. And depending on who really populates your personal life, there is always a sense of imbalance in the sharing of responsibilities. And I do not only mean responsibilities, domestic responsibilities in terms of the actual doing of tasks, such as who's cleaning homes, who's washing vessels, but also there is a lot of emotional labor to just keep track of groceries, for instance, or who's negotiating with if you have domestic help, just trying to ensure that they come on time, paying them a fair wage, negotiating their holidays. A lot of this tends to fall on women in my observation, and it is rarely recognized as labor. So therefore, I do feel that women, even when they talk about work-life balance, it's not just work-life balance, but also life-life balance A. And second, I'd really like everyone to think that why does personal life get equated to things like, only limited to things like children, pleasing in-laws, spending time with husbands. I think personal life needs to be much more richer than that too, and make space for your own self, for self-care, pursuing your own interests, because those are very essential to avoid burnout. Just centering your own pleasure and your own desires. So,
And absolutely your health, right? So that's something I think as women we tend to forget in balancing all these roles. We tend to not give enough time taking care of our own health, without which we can't do any of these things. And one other point I would like to add here is this is also a bit to do with the system that we are in, right? For example, when I and my spouse work, and if there's someone at the door, the maid will come requesting me to go attend it, right? Because sir is in a call, right? We are also on a call, but that all that is the systemic change that has to come in to make our lives easier. But maybe one last question before we can take audience questions. So, because it's a panel as part of the women committee, what do you think are some systemic changes that we need to work on in order to encourage more women in computing in general? Anything from your experience that you would like to share?
Institutional support. Well, I didn't face any problems on that end. I do not know about other academic institutions, but IITs are fairly good in that aspect. With newer IITs, there is an infrastructural issue that there are no daycare centers. They are far from the city. So if you have to commute for the whole day to your institution, then who looks after your younger child or old parents? So that becomes a problem. But with an established IIT with a campus life, women academicians are fairly good, able to manage things. And we get variety of leaves, maternity leave, childcare leave, which includes parental helps also. I mean, we can also take leave for aging parents. So these support systems are already there given by Government of India. So we should exploit them. And flexi working hours, which IIT is giving us, apart from your scheduled classes and other meetings, conferences, you get your time to when you want to do your research, as long as your office hours with the students are fixed. But then that has a side effect that you end up working 24/7. If you have a 9 to 5 job where you leave the house, go there and work, that is one way to work. But after you return at 5, you have nothing to look back and nobody's waiting for you at your profession. But if you have flexi hours, the side effect is that you are working continuously. You had a meeting for 15 minutes, you attend to your family, you do something else, and then again you go back to your research problem, you start reading the paper or whatever. So it depends on your dedication or your liking. I like to work continuously, so I don't mind. But those who want a separation between work and family life, for them these flexi hours might not suit. But overall, I find that with the dedication from our end and little support from the institution, we are okay at higher education institute.
Yeah, and the main thing that you mentioned that I would like to reiterate is that we should exploit all these opportunities, right, with no guilt. That's the main thing. I think we feel guilty of availing.
Yes, definitely.
these.
So we should overcome that guilt. So we do feel guilty, and even if you don't feel guilty, the society makes you feel guilty. And there's no way out. You have to be strong, and I mean, it's your life, your career, so you manage. Yes.
You can grab a mic if you have anything more to add.
Okay, so I think for those of us who are in situations where flexible working hours are allowed, I think you all should consider yourself fortunate, especially speaking for myself, where my circadian rhythm is fundamentally at odds with how social life is structured in human society. I'm a night owl. So you were asking if there are any students who go to bed at 12 a.m. I come alive at that time. I tend to, especially when I'm writing, because writing is just a very intensive, very involved, immersive activity, which I can only do at night. I tend to sleep at 7 a.m., 8 a.m. in the morning after, having worked through the night. So I'm a big advocate for flexible working hours, as long as you're taking care of your responsibilities. I mean, at what time you do it shouldn't matter. I think fundamentally I interrogate the notion of, I need to see you at a site, I need to see your body in a particular site to believe and to trust that you are doing your job. And I think that's a basic trust deficiency that should be addressed. Otherwise, I think something that if you are on the wrong end of power, I think for women, for gender minorities, any kind of minorities, caste minorities, it's very important to understand the nature of power, because we often experience the wrong side of it. And therefore think about power, think about the ways in which it affects us, and strategically keep challenging it, because that's the only way institutions and structures will evolve and will change towards meeting various kinds of demand. So you should always understand how power operates, how you are situated in relation to power, and how can it be challenged, not for the sake of it, but to push towards more progressive approaches and just a more progressive way to live. So that's what I have.
I really like the way Himangi put it forward, that there are a lot of policies and things that Indian government actually put forward for us women to support, and we should definitely exploit that. But in addition to that, I would like to say that these policies, whoever is implementing these policies should have a little bit of empathy while implementing it. For example, just as a story sort of a thing, that one of my colleagues' student, a girl student, she was going for a conference, her very first international trip. she came to me and said that the institute is putting forward a restriction saying that the cheapest possible direct flight she has to take, and which was around 1 a.m., which was asking her to like be there at the New York airport at 1 a.m., and which she was not comfortable with because it was her first international flight. And like, I think irrespective of gender, you will not feel comfortable to be at anywhere at like 1 a.m. But specifically with respect to the gender female, she was more scared. And then we had to put forward a request specifically saying that, can you please discard this particular rule saying that cheapest possible thing, and can we have a little bit more, like 25,000 more, and get her another flight? So these kind of policies are there, but whoever is implementing it, it's nice to have some empathy while implementing it. That's one thing. And another thing is that everybody, I am a strong believer that everybody who gets something from the society should give it back. And as a woman, I think we have more responsibility towards that. I belong to a family, a village where the gender inequality is there. Like, I belong to Rajasthan, and in my entire village, still the situation is that child marriage is very common. I am the first woman who came out of Rajasthan to from my village, who came out of Rajasthan to to pursue higher education and so on and so forth. So whenever I go home, I feel like everybody is judging me. Like, what did she do? Is she successful? And all of those things. So yeah. So I think as a woman, we have more responsibility to make a good example out of ourselves and show that we can do it all. Like, I am not supporting that we should do it all. We should like have boundaries and say that, oh, I can't do this. But for the society kind of society where I belong to, I have to say and I have to portray an image that I can do it all, and you should allow your girl child to do that as well. So that's one thing.
Yeah, maybe just one last point. Continuing what Priyanka was saying, I think as people who are already doing something, be it academia, industry, or wherever, or researchers, I think just sharing what we do and sharing our experiences and being available for newer students in whatever form, it will be very helpful. Because what I'm realizing is that there is a lack of awareness, not only in the students, but also in the caretakers of the students, right? The parents, that generation still may be unaware. So there's a lot of people are scared. What if my girl does A? What will happen to her? All of those things. So I think just sharing through whatever medium and maybe channels it's possible, that may even help take this policy not necessarily policy based, but general community awareness about what can you do, what are the ways that what are the challenges you need to mitigate, what are the opportunities that are there, and probably not just harping over the fact that, okay, there is inequality and I have a reserved seat. I'm not talking about that. I'm just talking about, yes, I'm here to listen to, or this is what I've been doing. If you have a question, just ask. That kind of availability may be something that will be very useful.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for those candid conversations. So we'll probably take a few questions from the audience. Please pass around the mic here. Maybe you can take another mic from here as well.
So, hello, ma'am. My question is to Preeti, ma'am. Like, you were talking about the social change which you were wanting. And I personally believe in a principle that unless or until every individual man changes his perspective on a common problem, we cannot bring in a social change. So in what way you influence the individual person's thought so that you could bring in the social change?
In what way do we influence an individual's thought? I think that's a very tall order. And I think that's too much belief that we are powerful enough to do that. I think it's not something that you can expect to happen overnight. I think in my interactions, especially with students, often there are some moments in the classroom where, a certain question is posed that sparks thought. And I find that these moments can't really be very deliberately designed. Like if I'm setting out to do it very deliberately, most often than not, it does not happen. So I think for me as an instructor, it's very essential to just create an environment, an atmosphere where dialogue is very, we are able to engage in dialogue more easily. And that often leads to a much more productive conversation. I think sometimes students are also intrigued, just by the way you move through life, in the way that that they observe you doing that, and they come to you with certain kinds of questions, which tells you that okay, they've latched on to something, and they are interested in knowing more, and they are probably going to be a more willing listener to what you're trying to say, because it's quite unfeasible, unrealistic to expect that, if you're teaching a class even of 30 students, that everybody is going to walk out transformed. And especially for people who are beginning their faculty careers, I would say that, not to overreach and aim for goals of that kind, because these are very incremental changes that happen. So we should also temper our ambitions as instructors and be realistic about what is possible. But as far as classroom dynamics go, this is what I have to share. I'm assuming you're a student and you're asking from that perspective.
I'm a student, but I asked in the perspective of the villages guy, because I also used to go to the ration shops and etc. So that I asked in that perspective, but I got the answer.
I think that's just a very larger issue, and like I said, there are several of us doing a part in it. But even with that, so the Aadhaar issue went to the Supreme Court, right? And then the Supreme Court ruled that without Aadhaar, you cannot get any government benefits. So I think given that the verdict has come from there, there's very little that we can do. But increasingly, so what I used to be told in the early days of my research, so I started studying Aadhaar in 2016. I do a lot of my work in Rajasthan. Rajasthan introduced Aadhaar in the PDS 2015, late 2015. And what a lot of the government people would tell me is that these are teething problems. It's a new infrastructure. It will settle. Academics like you, activists, you all are just being very impatient. You're not giving technology a fair chance. But we are in 2025 now. I haven't seen a lot of these problems resolved. So I think when it comes to technology, we just tend to become very emotional, and we tend to want to protect technology and serve and advocate in favor of technology rather than advocate in favor of people. It requires a fundamental shift in thinking, and not feel so emotionally about the digital aspect of things. It's eventually it has to serve people. It has to be human centered. So.
Yeah. So thank you so much for the session. It was very insightful. Coming to what you just last said about Aadhaar, there was a dissent by Diva Chandrachud as well regarding the Aadhaar judgment. And basically my question was that vis-a-vis social security in the US, how does Aadhaar stack up? That was my question. And going forward, what do you feel are certain guardrails that we can use to, to just safeguard the system which is already being established?
I think the United States does not have an equivalent system of Aadhaar. There is a tendency to conflate their social security number system to Aadhaar, but that's not the case. They don't use their SSNs in the way that we use Aadhaar. And when it comes to safeguarding systems, I just have a different take on it. I feel you should be safeguarding people foremostly. The problem again, just the way that I ended my previous response, where I said that we tend to get emotional about technology. I feel you need to get emotional about people and their welfare and their well-being, rather than say that my priority is to safeguard systems. So what happens is that currently there is no alternative to Aadhaar. If you do not pass fingerprint authentication, you don't get your ration. So Rajasthan at least has introduced that if your fingerprints fail at the time of authentication, then you can receive an OTP on your mobile number. However, that mobile number has to be linked to your Aadhaar. Now, when you're talking about people who live below the poverty line, owning a mobile phone handset itself is a lot of investment and an expense for them. In addition to that, you have to have your recharges. Often they don't have the money to do it. And therefore, you do not have a functional phone or even a functional mobile service to receive an OTP. So it almost like, to get government benefits, you have to first spend money. And if government benefits are for the poor, they are there because they don't have money in the first place. So you're just creating a very vicious cycle simply because you want to safeguard that system. You've invested money, you've invested rhetoric, you've invested discourse.
And I feel similarly it's the case for Digi Yatra as well.
Yeah.
My question is for Niyati, ma'am. So, yeah, there were two things that you mentioned throughout the session that I resonated with in from different perspectives. The first thing that you said is like about your entrepreneur, like your startup journey. So, your like with what experience I primarily work on NLP, and like from what I've the little that I worked on language technology, there's this my foresight tells me that like language is one of the most versatile attributes of humans, and like in doing all of these tasks, like we are gradually moving towards achieving human level performance, and that's like kind of the long term ambition that most people have, most projects have. So don't you think that language will be like the most like language technology will be at the core of most future things? And like because you started off with the idea that I want to solve a problem that LLMs cannot. So I just, because that's an orthogonal opinion, I just wanted your take on this. And I also have another question, if I can, like, yeah. So the other. Okay, sure.
So your question is, will language? So I think language-based technologies will become a medium to communicate with machines. But will we solve all language-related problems from an AI perspective? Probably not very easily. Simply because it is so unstructured, and so far it's only the language in the form of grammar that these machines are able to start understanding, right? So there is this whole psycholinguistics piece, sociology side of things, or even structured side of things, code, or like there's one end of it which these models are not yet able to understand. So if you go back to the core of a transformer, it is looking at next token prediction. So everything that can be modeled as next token prediction will be solved. And yes, it'll get better and better and better. So I feel that LLMs out of the box may not solve all problems of unstructured data immediately, or maybe in the near future. However, language can become the medium of communication with machines, and machines here are your models.
Yeah, like to clarify what I said, because as humans we reason, and when we reason we think in language, right? Which is kind of like one way in which you can formulate reasoning as a next token prediction, provided assuming that next token prediction works well enough to model language.
So I would, so maybe one comment before I let another question come in, and we can talk offline. But as humans, we reason in language may or may not be a correct statement. Even before a human being starts talking, they start reasoning. They start having opinions, and they express it without language. So we don't really understand that wiring yet, right? I mean, that brain, and that I don't think we are able to replicate that wiring into a machines yet. I don't know at what pace it will happen, but what has definitely happened is that the way we communicate through language, machines have started understanding it. Again, it is English based. Lot of things it's not able to do. All of that is still there, but yeah, this just communication through language probably is, we are starting to get there.
Hello, ma'am. The question to open to the test over there. So the question is, there are a lot of API services are available like Azure, AWS. What are the A things, A problem that we talk today are equivalent services there. If you want to read an OCR, Azure Cognitive AI services there. So as a person, like I need to start from the scratch, learning all those basics. But at the end of the day, I'll be using those API to solve my problem. So how are you seeing this?
I think the question is that as a student you are learning basics, whereas there are a lot of tools which are solving the problems that are way higher up than basics, right? And the example he was giving was OCR and things like that. I think fundamental understanding of basic principles will be needed for you to even understand how that tool works underneath. Because let's say I have a tool in the world which I have all the APIs, I start using them. They'll give an output. But the moment it fails or it behaves in a certain way, unless you understand the basics, you won't be able to do it. So it may feel like a large gap that why am I learning probability or conditional probability and all that, but you will come back to it. Because I mean, just knowing that a certain principle works with A plus, whatever, 3 plus 4 is 7, I don't have to think about it. So imagine your basic computer science modules as that 3 plus 4 in this domain. Because at the end of it, you're using all of that put together in an application, right? So to be able to use a application of your basics correctly, you will need to know how it's working. And that's where these tools will be used. Will you probably write code to build a OCR engine from scratch? No. You will use the APIs. You'll probably improve the APIs. You will find an alternative for the APIs. You may not be writing the code in the way probably assignments expect you to in real world, but you will definitely be using those principles.
Not just that, right? Like in order to decide which API to call, right? You need to have the knowledge first. You should know what is there in the underlying thing and then why you want to use the API that you want to use. And that's why you would like to learn first.
So a non-AI ML person's answer. So I don't know what you meant by APIs, but overall the existing infrastructure or the library support which is there, and if everything is there, what is our role? But for the systems person like me, the APIs are not so useful. Actually, we have to see inside that how does it. I'll take an example of the convolution. So PyTorch's convolution is a built-in API. But if I am designing a hardware accelerator for it, APIs are very high-level languages, so they do not look at optimization. They are going to say, do these 1 million multiplications. But at the bottom level, when I am deploying these multiplications, I have a lot of things to do. I have to check what is the precision of these operators. Is it 8-bit, 16-bit, or 64-bit operator? Is the value 0? If one value is 0, why am I using the multiplier? And if I have 4 multipliers and lots of multiplications, so how do I schedule these multiplications? That is, how much workload to give to each processing element. So for that, if I am designing a system, I have to go inside the API, or rather the actual raw code, so that I can do the scheduling and look at all these intricacies and do the optimization. So from that angle, my students don't know API, they know how the CNN happens below PyTorch. So that is the motivation to do the fundamental courses. Thanks.
Okay, that's the last question we'll take before we.
I work at the intersection of HCI and healthcare. So I just have one question, or rather you can say some difficulties that I was facing. So whenever as a women researcher, I go to the fields and try to talk to people, sometimes I find it difficult to convince them to participate in the study, and specifically on topics which are related to healthcare, or recently I was working on a smoking study. So people were not ready to talk. So you also mentioned that you go to the field and you talk to people. So have you also faced certain difficulties early in your career? And if yes, how do you convince them to talk and you build that trust factor with them? And how do you navigate through such difficulties?
Okay, I hope this is audible. So I just want to say that this is not a difficulty necessarily that we face only in the early stages of our career. I think that's something that you are just going to have to come to terms with, if you're doing the kind of qualitative work that you're doing. I want to say IIIT Delhi has some excellent faculty in sociology. There's Gayatri Nair. There are also people like Pushpender who have done this kind of.
Supervisor.
Sorry?
Pushpendra Singh is my supervisor.
Okay, so you are coming from very well-established tradition where Pushpender has supervised a lot of these theses. I would recommend that you take a course on methods. In fact, at IIIT Delhi currently, because my PhD student is there attending a workshop. So I know they're having a workshop on research methods. So there are always ways to do it. I don't think I can encapsulate everything that I do because I teach courses on it, but it is normal, it is regular. Doing the kind of fieldwork that I do, I myself don't stop when somebody comes and says if I could give them some time to talk. So I often tell my students that thankfully that karma doesn't really come back to bite me in the field, but it is just what it is. There are ways to do it. I'm happy to speak to you offline about it. Yeah, thanks for your question.
We'll thank the panelists so much for all your candid responses, right? And I think this has been a very insightful session. Thank you so much.